Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending my monthly webinar here, Lunch and Learn. And this month we're going to talk about vermicomposting. So some people might be like, you know, obviously it's about worms, but is that raising earthworms? Is it, using it? Obviously, it's got composting in there. So it's probably about that. But yeah, so we're going to learn a little bit about what it means to use worms in your composting. So there's a lot of different ways you can compost. Some people are lazy like me, and I've got just a bin that I kind of throw everything in and outside. But I also have worms because they're handy, and there's different things that you can give different animals. I also use chickens, and it's very handy for that. So if everybody's interested, I always like to see where folks are watching from. So if you don't mind dropping your county and city in there, or if you just want to put in your county, that's fine too. If you're out of state, that's great. You can just put your state in. Always like to see where folks are. And if you have any questions at all as we're going through, please enter them in the chat box. And I will get to those questions at the end of the presentation. And it should last about an hour, give or take, maybe a little less, but with questions, it might run a little bit late. So if you need to drop off at any time, that is absolutely fine. I do record these. This one has been done in the past, so it's already up on our YouTube channel. And I, tend to do it about every other year or so because it's pretty fascinating and people really like to learn about worms. So let me go ahead. I'm going to, gonna go ahead and start. All right. So what is composting? Most of you already know that. The elementary answer to that is it's basically just taking organic matter that could be stuff from your kitchen, leftover celery that got a little rotten in your drawer, maybe the peelings from your carrots that you put into your chicken and dumplings last night. But basically, all of that stuff, it's all organic matter. And so when you return that back into soil, essentially, or some type of a organic humus that can be added back into the lovely, heavy clay soil that we have here in Georgia, it can do a lot of good things for your plants. It adds kind of that black gold that you buy from black cow or mushroom compost. It makes it easier for those roots to grow through it. It can help with drainage. It helps hold water. There's a lot of good things about it. So, what's in compost? Everybody knows what it is, but let's break it down a little bit more. Okay, so you have two parts to it. You have your browns and your greens. This is probably the easiest way to think about it. So, your browns are going to provide your carbon. That's going to be your dry stuff, dry leaves, cardboard not with wax on it, newspaper, if you still have that, anything that is brown, that's stuff like, that you're going to find out in the earth. Even wood chips, it does break down quicker if the wood chips are smaller. So, you can throw it out there in a big pile and it will eventually break down, but you can always add some of that, branches and things, because the microbes and bacteria and fungi will all break that down for you. And then, of course, the greens, the nitrogen, that's going to help the microbes grow and reproduce. It's an active food. That's going to be like your food scraps, your carrot tops, your cabbage leaves, lettuce, stuff like that. Things along that nature. Manure, even, that's going to be active, if you want to think about it that way. And so when you're putting those into a compost pile, the ideal ratio is going to be about 70% of that brown stuff and about 30% of that green stuff. Well, 75, 30. The numbers don't quite add up. Because there's some flexibility in there. So in nature, there is never 100% it's got to be this way. There's always a little bit of variability in there. So if you got a little bit extra grass clippings and you throw those in there, that's fine. It'll balance out over time. So your carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be about 25 to 1, give or take, and that's for active composting. So generally when you do a regular compost pile, and I'll go into the different types of composting, for instance, like a hot compost pile, that's going to have kind of alternating layers or all mishmashed mixed up. And you're going to have about a 3 foot tall pile by about a 3 foot wide pile. And you need that so that you can get that pile to heat up and decompose quickly. And it won't smell bad, don't worry. But here's roughly a list of what those browns and greens are. You know, like I said, there's some variability, but you can see there what the generalized list of things would be. And then if you got something else, you just kind of compare it against that kind of stuff. So your visual rule, again, you know, there's no reason to be, oh, I've got to put in 75% and 25%. Just add roughly twice as much or a little bit more brown stuff as you're adding green stuff, and you should be fine. The problem lies when you just have a pile of leaves or a pile of wood chips, then it slows everything down because it takes longer. All right, so what is in compost? So macroorganisms, those are going to be your bigger organisms. Pretty much what you see here is kind of a mixture of all. Those are going to be like bacteria and fungi are in the compost process. Insects and worms are going to be the bigger stuff. Obviously, bacteria, fungi, the little stuff. So we all know the benefits of it, but let's do a quick recap on that. If you're going out and buying black cow or mushroom compost or something like that, save yourself some money. You can do it yourself. So you can make yourself a really just unglorious pile out in your backyard someplace towards the back behind stuff. Nobody's going to notice it's there, but it'll provide you a nice, good, rich organic material once it decomposes fully. It's going to improve your soil fertility. It's going to protect the environment by keeping all of that stuff out of landfills. And as I mentioned with the compost, what it does for soil is great. And so it can act as a sponge and hold water in. So your plants need a lot less water. And it's going to reduce the need for synthetic fertilizers because there is some, depending on what you have in there, of course, there is some natural organic fertilizer. Like for instance, if you threw fish heads in there, fish meal. But we don't necessarily recommend that in a household setting. It's also going to help store carbon in in the sequestration process. And again, it's going to keep, even at work, it's going to keep that stuff out of the landfill process. So it's just better for the environment in general. Again, why? You can kind of see here. I'm not going to go into it too much. If you're curious, I always offer my slide decks up for folks to have after the fact if you would like to use that. I provide it in a PDF format, so you can get my email address off the back end here on the last slide and just email me and let me know you would like a copy. I'm happy to provide that. So this kind of organic compost, organic nutrients, fertilizers, much slower release. It's not going to burn your plants, that kind of stuff. A lot of people are into that these days, and that's a good thing. It's a little less hard on the environment. Versus using synthetics. Here, we don't have as much problem with some of the issues that synthetic fertilizers are going to have, where they leave salts behind, that kind of stuff. Out west, you have a lot of issues like that as they pump up the groundwater. You're kind of recirculating all of that because it's a little bit more arid, so that can pose some problems. Here, you don't have as much of an issue, but if you're not careful, a lot of that can head out and run off, and you've got a lot of non-point source pollution that ends up into the rivers and the streams. It might end up into your detention pond. You end up with a lot of algae. We deal with a lot of that, so that can help prevent some of those issues. Here's a few other facts. You can see here that I'm going to go ahead and mute the few people that for whatever reason it did not get muted. If you notice that you are not muted, please mute yourself. So you can see here there are just a few statistics about composting and how good it is for the environment. You can see that through a lot of these USDA programs that there's been a really big just kind of evangelizing event of composting in general. And that's great. We're seeing a lot of schools that are getting money for composting, and they're implementing big programs. I think Georgia Tech actually, I think it was Georgia Tech, I just heard that they received a huge grant, and they may have like this huge industrial sized composter that they can do not just from the school itself, but other businesses and things. And so hopefully they're scaling that, and that can be a big thing coming up. So, there's a lot of good stuff going on, and I'm happy to see that. So the different types of composting, we're going to start diving in now. So this is the simplified version. I mean, yes, there are other kinds in there, but I don't want to go too in depth into the other ones. So the ones just for, that most people are going to practice in their backyard, that's going to be cold or passive composting. That's literally where you have a pile of stuff that you just throw, old weeds, maybe branches, leaves, all of that stuff just goes into a big pile out in your backyard, and you really don't think about it. You come back, maybe occasionally turn it. You probably aren't watering it. You probably aren't doing anything active in moving that around, nor are you monitoring how tall it is or how wide it is. You're just kind of throwing it in there and letting nature do its thing. Perfectly fine. Just takes a lot longer for all of that to actively break down, and that's okay. I am happy to do that. I have a plastic bin, and I throw all my stuff in there. It's got a little view door I can open up down at the bottom, and over the years I just collect out what I need for if I'm repotting something or want to add something in. So yeah, perfectly fine. Then there's active or hot composting, and that is what some folks will do if they are like, let's speed up this process. I want, some compost for my garden, so I'm gonna make sure that I've got a 3 foot high pile by 3 foot wide. I'm keeping it nice and active. You're seeing the steam come off of it as the vegetative material is breaking down, as those microbes are doing their job, and thermophiles, that kind of thing. Um, so that is active composting. And then you have vermicomposting. So some people like to go fishing with the worms, and you're like, oh, I'm going to grow my own. It's pretty easy. And some people want all the goodies that come from the worms, and that's like the worm tailings. Maybe they want to reproduce those worms and sell them. You can use them for composting in this case, or you could sell them as for fishing or whatever you want. So that's what we're going to focus on. Okay, so here's just a little bit more. Like I said, going over this really quick. Cold composting, breaking it down slowly, anaerobic, takes the least amount of effort, can take a while. Hot, so faster, quicker, can reach hot internal temperatures. So if you're in Gwinnett County and you're driving past all those new subdivisions they're putting up, and they've gone out and chipped up those trees, and you see on a cold fall morning all of that steam that's rising off of those, well, that's all those microbes breaking down the cellulose. So you've basically got a huge composting pile going on, a hot active compost pile. And you can optimize that, of course, by being more scientific about it and keeping the carbon and nitrogen ratios where they need to be, air and water, that kind of thing. And then vermicomposting. So vermiculture, that's just the culture of earthworms, growing them, trying to increase their number. As I mentioned, you might do that for a variety of reasons. And then there's vermicomposting, and that's where you're using them to break down those materials that you would probably normally put into a compost pile. But that's going to give you that lovely, rich, humusy material in about 3 to 6 months, along with some other goodies that you can use for fertilizers in your garden. So there is a lot of value. All you have to do is go on to Amazon and look and see what a bag of earthworm tailings costs. It's going to be a great way to get rid of a lot of stuff. I personally have a bin of worms. They live on my porch. As I'm making dinner or whatever, or I forget the bag of tomatoes in the fridge, sometimes I'll take the rotten tomatoes out and go put them in there and feed them because I'm not going to give them to my chickens. Nobody wants rotten tomatoes, but the worms sure do. That is like one of their absolute favorites. So you can put scrap paper if you've got, old taxes or other things on just paper, not glossy, not waxy, but just, off the printer. Most of that's soy ink anymore, so it's okay. You can use that for your worms. Garden crop remains. I mean, if you've got a bin outside that you're using or a box or something, toss your old brassicas, like after you harvest all your collards, or in the spring, if you're getting rid of your tomato plants, you can toss all that in. So it's a little bit like an alternate to a regular composting program. So again, fertilizer, great for your soil biome and will promote activity of like enzymes and plant growth regulators. Weeds, you don't want those in there. And they also regulate availability of essential plant nutrients. So it's kind of cool. So here's a little bit of a visual for you to take a look at. So here's a UGA engineering outreach program where they used worm castings to grow stuff. And that's why I love little scientific experiments like this, because you could visually see what is happening here. So here, down at the bottom on the left, you've got plants or tomato plants that were grown in potting soil or potting mix, just a, planting mix. Then good old Georgia red clay, you see there in the middle, and then worm castings on the right. And you can see those worm castings really gave those tomato seedlings a really big oomph. And the potting mix and the Georgia soil, not a whole lot of change there, but those worm castings really helped a lot. And you can see the corn on the right, so you can see where you've used worm castings and then where you haven't seen them. So they are definitely giving a big boost to the plants that you're trying to grow. So if you're not going on a high volume and you have maybe just a one raised bed or some containers at home that you have out on your balcony or your back porch or something like that, this would be perfect. And so you can either grow your own or you can purchase them. Of course, this is trying to sell you on growing your own, but ideally, things grew about 3 times faster. So I don't know about you, but being a gardener, that's pretty good stuff. And I think I would personally like it if my plants were a lot larger and more lush and produced more produce. Here's another study done by North Carolina Extension, and you've got the small turnip on the left where they didn't use any vermicompost. The medium turnip, they did about 10% by volume, and then the large was about 20%. So that's a pretty good visual reminder of how good this can be for your plants. All right, so species and environment. Not every worm is cut out to be a good worm for vermicomposting. Remember, vermiculture is just the production of worms, and they could be, any type. A lot of them fishing worms, that kind of stuff. But you need a special type of worm for composting. And those worms are considered to be epigeic. And what that basically means is that I'm going to get rid of my picture here so you can see better. Epigeic basically means that they live in that top O horizon, or the topsoil, essentially. They don't go very deep into the ground, so they're going to live in that leaf litter and all of that stuff that kind of filters down into the forest floor. They live and they thrive in that top environment, and they deposit their castings on that surface. So your most common one, so if you were to go and order some online, which is a very easy way to do it, Yersinia fetida, or the red wiggler worm. And just as an aside, red wigglers that you buy for fishing purposes are not the same worms as what you're going to buy for composting. That's just a common name, and that is not necessarily what you would be getting. You would not necessarily be getting the Yersinia fetida if you were purchasing a red wiggler over at a fishing outfit. So the ideal temperature for earthworms, where they're most active and they're going to feed the most and reproduce, about 70 degrees. So here in Georgia, North Georgia, that's gonna be like spring-ish to probably early midsummer, and then pick up again in late September, October through probably our first frost. That's when they're going to be their most busy. You can extend that a little bit if you choose to build a like a large pen or something like that that's got ground contact in your backyard, where you put maybe some kind of landscape fabric or something those worms can't get through. And then you have basically landscape timbers or something, and that plastic or landscape fabric is holding them in there with a lid. And then you just go add stuff to it. You may be able to buy a little extra time. They will occasionally feed in the wintertime, but it really slows down. And when it's going to be super cold, if you are keeping them outside on your porch or wherever, maybe bring them into the garage. So when we're going to deal with some below zero, below 32, or definitely down into the single digits or teens, you want to bring them in where they're a little bit more sheltered. So also a good worm bin, going to be about a pH of 7 neutral. You can vary a little bit on either side of that, but when you start ranging down to acidic, or when you start ranging to alkaline, you're going to have some problems. So we'll talk about that. All right. Worms are hermaphrodites. Most worms are hermaphrodites. That means that they carry both female and male organs. So if you are in high school science. I don't think they do that in junior high anymore. But or you can remember back that far. I know, like some people like me, it was a long time ago. But you probably dissected a worm and you looked at all of that stuff. So you kind of have hopefully a little recollection of what they looked in there. But you've got that really weird kind of bumpy round organ on the worm, and it's called a clitella. That's going to release a mucus film that's going to cover both of those bands. So you'll get these two worms that are going to kind of line everything up. They're going to put a lot of mucus or slime out there, and then they're going to wriggle out of that band, which is going to leave behind this hardened shelled cocoon with the eggs. So that egg sac is going to be about the size of a grain of rice. It's going to start out kind of as a white color, and then over time, as that hardens, yellow, brown, etc. And then when it gets kind of that reddish color, that's when they hatch. And you've got a bunch of little baby worms. So it's kind of cool to watch when you have this box of worms and you have a bunch of adults, especially if you're just starting out. And then you come back, maybe a month later, and all of a sudden you've got all these tiny little worms. And that basically means they've had a little bit of fun in there. And that's good because that's making more worms so they can do more work for you. So those cocoons can have as many as like 10 eggs, but you probably will only have maybe half of that, 40% of those will actually emerge. That's normal. But those worms can produce eggs during that 70-degree temperature when they are most active. They can produce eggs every 7 to 10 days. So less than 2 weeks, every week to 2 weeks. So you can have about 1,000 baby earthworms every 6 months. That's a lot of worms. And those worms then, assuming you have pretty good temperatures, will then produce their own offspring after about 3 months. So that's a lot of worms. So what are these? They don't look like worms. And you're correct. So these are actually called potworms. Generally speaking, if you get a little over enthusiastic in feeding your worms, I get it. Sometimes it's fun to watch them reproduce, and you put a whole lot of stuff in there. Maybe you're making a lot of salads or whatever, but you're overfeeding them for the size box that you have where you have your worms. You may end up with these. These are called potworms. So they're relatives of the earthworms, but their presence in that environment can indicate an imbalance in the conditions of your worm box. So they're not going to hurt the worms, but they do directly compete for food. So most people, pound for pound, you're going to get a lot more benefit out of those earthworms than you would these icky little kind of whitish worms. I'm not a huge worm fan. They do good things, don't get me wrong, but they're a little creepy. I don't particularly care for them. I don't really like holding them, which is hilarious. It is kind of just a mental thing. But if you see these in your worm box, that means likely there are some issues. So let's take a look at that. So, what are some of the problems? Well, your pH might be a little too acidic. So you might have put, it might be a combination of the bedding that you've got. It may be that you put some citrus in there. Some of the things that you might have put in there have brought that pH down too low. It definitely could be too wet. There's some other things. You might end up with soldier fly larvae in there. And those chickens like those, by the way. Those are sold and a lot of money if you buy those. But you might see soldier fly larvae as well. And those show up because it's too wet. That means that you're putting too many tailings of, or not tailings, but you're putting too many food sources in there for them. You're overfeeding them, in other words. It may also be because there's too much starch. So you can put some starchy stuff in there, but you have to kind of be careful about what you're putting in there because it can be too much. So remedies, what do you do to fix it? So if it's too wet, you can add a carbon source, and that could be shredded up cardboard, shredded up paper, something like that that's going to both double as bedding and soak up some of that moisture, a sponge, if you will. You can cut back on those fruit and vegetable scraps. So you can also conversely go and make another worm box, put some more worms in there, and then, you've got more and you can continue to put out your vegetable scraps in the same amount. And then remove that fermenting extra food. So if you've put too much in there and they can't keep up, just remove it. Put it into a regular compost bin. It's not going to hurt anything. You can go in there and try to aerate the soil. That's not too difficult. All that is, get a trowel, kind of turn that soil over, and or the bedding and the worms and all that, and that's pretty easy. You can also add some crushed eggshells if you've got a pH issue. And so you can use test strips that you can use for pools or whatever. That's a good way to check the pH. You can also use a garden pH tester, and that'll give you a rough idea of what the pH is in there. And if it's way off of 7, go ahead and add that calcium, so the eggshells, to slowly start to neutralize the pH. Okay, habitats. So there's different ways you can go about this. You can do DIY worm boxes, which are just made out of bins. You can go purchase an expensive worm box if you want to do that, or towers. Those are kind of your choices. I didn't add on here, but you can do it looks a little bit like a raised bed, and then you just use the landscape fabric and it's in contact with the soil. So the soil temperature helps regulate, but because you're using a landscape fabric, they can't get through that. And those can be much larger, and you have those outside. So it's kind of an alternative to your, I guess, smaller created worm box. But the worm boxes and that kind of thing, that works great for your porch to keep near your house. So if you want to make your own, it's pretty easy. So you just go to a big box store and you get some big boxes, just plastic tubs or buckets. You want to get about 3 or 4 of those, and you can see there. These are, I don't know, I'd venture to say probably like 78 quart or something like that. So just a good size, but you don't have to do that. You can get 3-gallon, which are considerably smaller. You can even get some buckets from one of the big box stores. And then you're going to get 4 small plastic containers, like just cups or margarine containers, butter containers, that kind of thing. And then some kind of bedding. So shredded newspaper, coconut core, peat moss, all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. Shredded up cardboard boxes with no wax or anything on them, stuff like that. You're going to turn it over, flip it over so you're looking at the bottom, and you're going to drill holes in 2 to 3 tubs. If you have 4, obviously you don't want them escaping out, so you're going to leave 1 tub untouched. But you're going to go and you're going to put a bunch of little holes in there, and this is for drainage. So those small containers I was talking about here, I think they use margarine containers or sour cream or something like that. Those small containers are going to leave an area underneath them where all that stuff that drains down through that the worms have, all that moisture, that's all going to drain down through to this area here. So that's called leachate. And here you can see there's different ways. You can use bricks too if you want to do that, if you don't want to use plastic containers. There's lots of different ways to do it. And then you just basically layer them. So here's what it looks like as a cross section. If you want to get super fancy, you could even put a little tap there in the bottom of it so you don't have to take it all apart. You can just open the spigot and let the worm tea kind of trickle out. All of this can be used. So it's a great thing, worm tea. So you can see there you have the holes for the air because they need that, and the bedding material. And then as you move or rough that around, you've those little holes that you've put in that one, the worm castings or the compost part will kind of fall through. And then you have the storage bin below. So you'll have the drier castings, and then you will have the more liquid worm tea, which continues to trickle on down through to the bottom. And then you have the commercialized worm towers. So if you don't want to make your own, and that's perfectly fine, you can go and buy one, or you can buy one that somebody else has already made for you. They're not terribly expensive. I mean, you could probably find something that's in the 30 to 70 or 80 range. Of course, you can go more than that if you want to. You can go over $100 as well. And you can see down there, you have that little framed one. You can put that out near your garden and toss stuff in it. And then there's an area for you to get the compost out at the bottom. So anything from heavy plastic all the way to things that probably won't last you more than maybe 5 years. But hey, that's great. You're still doing a good thing by composting in the first place. So what do you use for bedding? As I mentioned, there are a lot of different things that you can use for bedding. So you can use peat moss, and usually those come in big bricks. And then you kind of carve some of that off, hydrate it. So you have to add water because it's dehydrated at the time. And then fluff it up, and that works great. That's actually what I use in my worm bin. Coconut coir, that's also a brick that you kind of break down. It probably shows up here in one of the other slides so you can see what it looks like. It's also used as a planting material, so it's versatile. And then if you're running on the poor side, no shame in that. You can use dry dead leaves. Anything, like I said, that's an organic matter that starts, basically as something that's dry or slightly moist that those worms can live in and break down. And then you have commercial bedding. You also have shredded paper, corrugated cardboard. So if you do a lot of shredding, or your office has a lot of shredding, and normally they would just dispose of that or put that out for trash, you could take that, use that for your worms. You can use wood shavings. So you can actually go buy commercial wood shavings for chickens or horses and use that. Hay or straw, you can purchase that at the big box stores. And then commercial bedding again, which could be any one of those, but generally tends to be the most expensive. So things to remember, about 50% of that bedding can be used as food, but you do have to feed them. So when you're first starting out, they're okay to process some of that. And there is nutritional value in all of these, but there is more nutritional value in some of these. Aeration is a must, so go in there and make sure that you kind of flip over so it doesn't get too heavy and wet and settle in certain areas. Because if you have, let's say, some rotten apples and you've put those in there, those will kind of get really saturate the bedding around there. So move that around, aerate it a little bit. And make sure that if it's too dry outside, if you keep them on your porch or out near your garden, if it's been really dry, you will want to add a little bit of water back to the system because it'll evaporate just like anything else. It's an open air system. So make sure that you do keep some moisture in there. We'll talk about how much. in a bit. Here's that coconut coir, and that's mixed with paper shreds. So that's a good option if you have it. Like I said, newspaper, harder and harder to come by because not as many places are printing anymore. So you can often get it from your home office or from your regular office if you have that. And then those big blocks, break that apart and then hydrate it. So put some in a bucket with some water to hydrate, and then that works great. Peat moss is also great. I use that also, and I have had one big block for, gosh, years and years because it rehydrates. You get a lot of volume for it. And the worms take a while to kind of break this down before you have to harvest it. So it lasts for a really long time. So here's what it looks like when you mix that with the paper. And it's, pretty close to, it looks very similar. But yeah, anything organic, it's all good. And then here's what they eat. So vegetables, as I mentioned, anything that you might have, especially rotten, they don't really care about that. You might throw that out in your compost heap too, but here you're getting the benefit of the tailings from the worms. So that's good. And the compost tea, you can feed that back to your plants, and it gives you a lot more benefit with the tea and the fertilizer than just the compost heap out in your backyard. Fruit, coffee grounds, they'll eat that too. Tea bags, leaves, yard waste, all the same things that you would use in your compost bin that you would just do hot or cold composting from. All right, don't feed, same thing. Don't feed meat. Don't feed dairy. Don't feed citrus, too acidic. Sauces, oils. So don't take those leftovers that have been sitting in the back of your fridge for a month and a half. This is not where they go, okay? You can give some of those to your chickens if they're not moldy. If you have chickens, they actually will eat a lot of the foods that you eat, not as their main diet, but you can give them stuff like this as a treat, if you will. So if you've got food in your fridge that's been there for a week, week and a half, and you don't want to eat it, you can feed it to the birds. But yeah, most of the stuff that goes to the worms is the same stuff that you would put in your regular compost bin. So again, here, what do you feed them and what you don't feed them? Same thing. Just a good pictorial of it. How do you feed it? Well, here's some gross stuff. I don't know if I would be cutting things up or chopping them up, but it does help. Rotting tomatoes, they love those. They love rotting bananas. They love rotten stuff. That's why they live out on the porch. So smaller pieces are better. Obviously, they'll break down quicker. They've got to be able to eat it. They got to be able to get into it. So if I'm putting tomatoes or apples or something that's just past its prime, I'll usually take the spoon or the trowel and break a hole into it so that they can get in there and eat. It's also kind of fascinating. I'm not sure who grinds, purees, shreds, or does all of that, but if you live alone and you don't have a lot of food to give them, you could certainly just dump it into a bag in the freezer so it doesn't smell. And then if you really, really wanted to help them out, you could chop it up a little bit, but that's not necessary. So this is kind of the goodies that you get after the fact, in addition to just the satisfaction of knowing that you've got another pet. So you can get worm castings, and these are expensive if you go take a look at what the cost is. But you can see, obviously, based on the pictorial that I had at the beginning, that they are a good thing for your plants. They love that. You can get the leachate, that's the stuff down at the bottom, and worm tea. So there's a little bit of a difference. We'll go over that. So how do you get the goodies out of the box? That's a good question. There's different ways of separating your worms when you need to get the bedding material out to use it for plants. So you can use the vertical light method. You pile all that old bedding that they're in into kind of a volcano, a big conical structure. Worms don't like light. So you take a very strong light source, You can either leave it out in the sun or you just hang a bulb over it. Put it over the top of that and wait about 15 minutes. Those worms are going to move away from that. They're going to migrate down into the into the bedding at the base and stay away from that light. So you can just remove each layer as they do that until they're down at the bottom, and pretty much all you have is just the worms. So at that point, you would then come back in with some new bedding. Bait separation. So you push all the old stuff over to one side, and then you add new stuff on the other side, and that's where you put your food that you're going to feed them. So put some rotten tomatoes or some past their prime apples or whatever else on the new side with the new bedding, and they will all migrate over there to feed. So if you haven't fed them in the past week and you do that, they'll all migrate over to that food source, and then you can harvest, get out the old stuff. Now you may have some egg casings in there. So there are some further ways that you can do, like the screening sort method. If you don't really care if you've got those egg casings in there, doing the bait separation method, that's just fine. If you want to save those earthworm egg casings, then you can use that screen sorting method. So you can buy, they'll sell these online in just enough that you can make one of these. You don't have to buy a ton of hardware cloth. So you can just buy it super cheap, just enough to make a little box like this. And that's going to be 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch hardware cloth, which is just a metal screening material, but at each little square is going to either going to be a 1/4 or an 1/8 inch. And that's going to sort out or allow the material, the used material, to fall down into your bucket, and those earthworm egg casings are going to stay behind. And then you can take those out, throw them back in, put them in a new bin if you want to do that. And you've saved the egg casings. And then the last one is the most labor intensive. You just dump it all out on a tarp, pull your worms and your egg casings out, and then you're left with the rest of that stuff that you can go use for your plants. So what do you use those worm castings for? Well, I mean, you can use it as a soil additive, as I mentioned. Soilless mix, just mix it in with your house plants for a little extra boost. And then you can add a tea or a slurry and make a earthworm tea, which then you can feed back to them when you water them. So if you're going to do a soil additive, when you add new plants, you take a handful of those castings and put it in the planting hole. So for instance, if you're out in your garden and you're putting in your new plants in the spring or the fall, you just put a little bit in each hole near the root system of the plant, and they will benefit from that. If you're propagating seeds, mix them in with that potting mix as you're putting your seeds in there. So 2 parts like the coconut coir to 1 part worm castings. And then as a general soil conditioner, and you can just kind of scrape them through the top layer of your soil. And as you rain or water, it'll trickle down through to the root system. Always, if you're going to put mulch down on your landscape plants, put that down before you mulch and scrape it into the top layer of the soil. So starting for container grown plants, like I showed in those first early slides, 25% worm castings to 75% potting soil. But any of those can really benefit, so if you don't have a ton of worm castings, some is better than none. Just look at it that way. So soilless mix, 40% castings, 30% perlite or vermiculite. That's going to be a good soilless mix for whatever it is that you're trying to grow. Worm tea. No, you're not drinking worms and tea, but your plants sure are. They love it. So it's a great natural fertilizer that you can use for pretty much any plants, not just outside. So to make that, take about 10 gallons of water. You can leave it out in the sun to dechlorinate it. And then put about 1 pound of earthworm castings. And again, if you don't have them now, you can certainly buy them. They're just expensive. In a mesh bag, kind of like cheesecloth, I guess, or pantyhose, something like that. Drop those castings in that bag into a 5-gallon bucket and cover it with about half that water. Add about a tablespoon of molasses or honey or sugar. That's basically to start the fermentation process. and then put a bubbler, just an aquarium bubbler in there, and let it run for 24 to 48 hours, and then just take the bag out, take the bubbler out, and then put the remaining water in there, and you've got worm tea. So you can buy the concentrate, but this is the leachate stuff that's down at the bottom of the bin. So don't throw it out. I mean, definitely this, you can use that, and you can also, this is what the worm castings are used for. Sometimes you'll mix them together and you'll end up with a really good fertilizer, and that isn't something that's really going to burn your plants. It's organic, can't beat that. So good stuff. You definitely want to keep that reserved for your plants. So here's your leachate. That's, as I mentioned, going to be the kind of coffee colored thickish liquid that drains out the bottom, and it may or may not have microorganisms that are good or bad in there. You really don't know. It's hard to know because, again, you've produced it yourself with your own worms. So it's got to be diluted, 10 parts water to 1 part leachate. And you really only want to use fresh leachate. So if you've just dumped it out of your worm bin, go ahead and use it there. So use it for your garden. You could use it for your plants if you have them in containers outside. But if you're going to use it regularly, go ahead and aerate it. That'll help prevent any anaerobic stuff from going on in there. So benign neglect, worms prefer that. Don't overfeed them. I mentioned things that are bad. If you put too much food in there, you get those pot worms. You can change the pH. It gets too wet. There's all sorts of things. So don't overfeed them. If you want and have a lot of extra stuff and you don't want to have a traditional compost bin, have several bins of worms. That's perfectly fine. Share with your friends. Sometimes we'll do programs at the library and we'll put containers of worms together, and we'll raffle it off for folks that come to those programs, so you can get your own bin at home. Remember that you got to change that bedding out periodically. So don't just keep putting stuff in the same. You'll notice it'll start to get kind of wet, a little too wet, and it doesn't look as good. So that's when you need to swap it out. Keep that worm bedding moist, but not too moist. Midsummer is when you're going to find the hardest time to keep it moist. You may have to go and dump some water in there just to keep them hydrated. So just make sure you go look periodically, but you don't need to do too much. Don't let them freeze. They will die. I've unfortunately figured this out the hard way. A couple of years ago, it's probably 3 years ago, we had about 60 hours of below zero temperatures. It was really cold, and I was more concerned with my chickens and keeping them warm than I was my poor worms. So a lot of the material around the worms froze. So some of the worms died because I was practicing too much benign neglect. So if it's going to get really cold, below 32 degrees, move them in your garage or your basement. Just get them out of there for a period of time. You don't have to do much else other than just moving them into a sheltered location. Be sensitive to big changes in the worm box. So again, if you start seeing those pot worms or you see the soldier fly larva, that means it's out of balance. And you probably need to do a little troubleshooting to figure out what's going on. Too wet, pH is off, add some stuff to soak it up, eggshells to change the pH, that kind of thing. And don't let them overpopulate. They will totally do that. Now you can leave them and they'll naturally die, but this is a good way to share. So if you've got folks that want their own worm bins and you've got a lot, go ahead and share with them. That's a good thing. So here's some good resources. And again, I mentioned that I am perfectly happy to provide the slide deck. So if you would like this, you can just catch my email on the last page, and I am happy to share. We also record, so that will be at the YouTube channel. It's up there right now, but if you want this particular recording, I'm happy to get that up there probably later this week, and you can see that and then get these resources there. So that's basically it. Here you can check out our other classes that we have coming up. The In the Garden series that I teach webinars, we usually do one webinar, lunch and learn a month, and then we do two evening webinars on Thursdays. So it's alternating. So Tuesday is always going to be a lunch and learn. Thursdays, twice a month, will be an evening 6 to 7 p.m. presentation. And then I record all of them, and those end up on that YouTube channel, Metro Master Gardener. That is the name of it. So we urge you to subscribe. Also, starting in the new year in March, we probably don't have a lot of folks that have the need for pesticide licensing CEUs. However, spread the word. We will start taking one evening webinar away from this series, and that will move to a new pesticide licensing CEU series that will be happening starting in 2026 to kind of fill the gaps for folks that don't want to take a whole day off to lose money. So we'll be offering some lunch and learns so they can watch over your lunch hour and in the evening after work so that you can get your CEUs for your pesticide licensing. And we hope that program will then grow. But in the meantime, you are welcome to watch that. You don't need CEUs. That's fine. You can learn all about turf diseases and insects that might live in your grass. Hope we'll be bringing in some specialists from UGA, PhDs, to talk about some of this stuff. So that's kind of a new thing that we'll be trying out, and a little bit more technical. So most of what I do typically here is going to be kind of, I call it going down the rabbit hole, and you learn about horticulture stuff. You may learn about entomology. You might learn about dendrology. I mean, like all sorts of stuff. I'm also a certified arborist, so I do a lot of arboriculture type stuff. So it's a little bit of everything, kind of a mishmash, but whatever seems to get me interested. And if you have topics that you would like to know more about, I'm happy to hear those, and that might end up being another presentation. So you can always email me and say, hey, I would love to hear more about whatever. We just did one on mushrooms, growing mushrooms at home. We just did another one on 10 things in your yard that you can make tea out of, and we talked about tea and what that is. We've even had firefly gardening, lots of good stuff. So I will look here and see if we have any questions. I'm having challenges harvesting the castings. Will we have time to get into that? Yes, and I did get into that. So that I should have given you some techniques that you can use to harvest those. So again, if you would like a copy of this so that you can have that particular slide so you can see exactly how to harvest, send me an email at this email and I will get that to you. All right. Nice. We've got some Savannah people, a lot of people from around here. That's great. Nice. Love it. Love it. Love when teachers come. That gives you some good stuff to teach your students. Effingham County. Okay, great. I love it. Could you keep the worm bin in a cool basement year round? Yes, you can do that. Most people get kind of squeamish about keeping worms in the house. They're more accepting of it if it's in a a porch or a garage, someplace that's not in the main living area. But yeah, you totally can. If you have a complete system that's enclosed, as long as you keep it fairly clean and you're careful about the balances of pH and stuff like that, yeah, you can completely keep it in your basement. That's fine. When it's cold, super cold, I'll bring mine into my garage. I don't bring it into my house. Like anything else, you don't want to move it back in and out and in and out. So if you're going to keep it in your basement, try to just keep it in your basement. My understand is that leachate is, yes, you're correct. And sorry about that. So the leachate is going to be that stuff that trickles down to the bottom of the bin. And that can be diluted and used as a fertilizer. And then your worm castings, those little nodules of worm poo essentially is put into a bag and dipped into water with a sugary substance to allow bacteria to kind of feed, and you ferment that, and then that's used as worm tea. So yes, you're right. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. I'm thinking one thing in my head and then it comes out. Yeah. Let's see. Can you do wood or metal looking to avoid plastic? So Really, that's going to depend, I guess, on how you're constructing your worm bin. If you have a bin outside under a tree someplace or in a shadier location that you want to have contact with the ground, that would probably be the best place where maybe you would um, use raised bed material that's metal. And you would then add your landscape fabric and you can add your worms there. And then you'll have the ground to kind of keep it insulated, and you have a lid on top of it usually so that animals don't go in there and help themselves to the worms, because they will eat those. Armadillos, other things will go in there. So you could do that. You can definitely use wood. Just be careful. You don't want to use treated lumber. So make sure that whatever you're using is not treated. You'll have to replace it periodically, but yeah, that's totally fine. Inside, in your garage, in a porch situation or something like that, um, the only way I can see using, I mean, you could use, I guess, a metal pot. You're still going to have something to raise up off the base because that leachate is going to come down through. If you're doing wood, you still have to have some type of plastic that's going to seal the base so that it doesn't drain through. You got to have something to seal it, in other words. So if you don't want to use a plastic bin, yes, you could probably come up with something else. I mean, any container really, as long as you're following the nesting situation, with holes in the bottom for leachate and that kind of thing, you could come up with all sorts of stuff. Yeah. Um, yeah. Okay. Do eggshells have to be washed and spotless? So I keep them for my chickens and I bake them. And that helps make sure I bake them at a very low temperature, like 250. They don't smell when they go through that process. It helps them kind of break down just a little bit so that they're easier to crush, and the birds will eat them. But I also put a little bit occasionally. When I check my pH, if it starts getting off, I'll put a little sprinkle of those into the worm bin as well. So just for health's sake, I keep a bowl of my eggshells in the fridge to kind of keep bacterial growth down. So it is better if you can bake them briefly. Let's see. You don't want eggshells, which are somewhat porous, absorb the chemicals in soap. So I don't put them in soap. I have, like I said, I have my own chickens, so I don't really have an issue with that. You really shouldn't be washing your eggs with soap. I just use water. Uh, Generally, the commercial egg industry, as far as I know, they're not using anything that would be um, concerning for that. That wouldn't fly with the Department of Agriculture. So if you'd like to email me about that, that might be interesting. Let's see. Cooking off the proteins. I assume that means eggshells. Yeah, killing bad things on the eggshells. That's the nitty gritty of it. And Jessica is very knowledgeable. Okay. Overpopulated. So, yes, you're going to basically tell just by the volume of the worms. So, by the end of the summer, generally, you're going to have, if you take a scoop, either a trowel or a spoon or something like that, and you scoop out, and every, over half of the bin, you get a pretty good scoop that's going to have somewhere, I'm just eyeballing it, 5 to 10 worms of various sizes in there. You probably do need to split the population and consider giving some away or making another bed for them. Maybe you can get a little business out of it, take up fishing so that you can use them. Aquaponics, please. Oh, I guess that's probably in asking about, oh, that one I do know a little bit about aquaponics, but that one might require a specialist. So I've got that written down. Um, okay. If you want this PDF with the slides, please just go ahead and email me at this particular email address, thelisa.klein@gwinnettcounty.com. I can go back through here, but it's usually just easier if folks can just email me instead of putting their email address in here. Let's see, I saw an in-ground worm bin. Yeah, so ants can be a problem, but generally not necessarily. What you're doing is you're mimicking their natural habitat. So these are epigeic, as I mentioned. They live in the forest litter, the stuff that's on top of the ground. They don't go down into the ground. So if you have a big enough worm bin, and when I mean big bin, I mean the size of a raised bed. So 4 by 8, something like that. They have some of these out at the UGA garden where they have the greenhouses and do a lot of experiential learning experiments, stuff like that. So they have some really big bins, and then they have a lid that they can put down on top of that to keep possums and raccoons and armadillos and stuff like that out of there, so they're not a problem. They didn't really mention much about ants. You can, of course, if you're treating around your yard to keep the ants out or to keep the populations down, they're probably not going to be a problem with the earthworms. So I wouldn't worry too much. But if you do see them there and you start to have a problem, you can use things like spinosad. Not the greatest, but better than using a inorganic type of chemical. Let's see. Again, if you're interested and you want the PDF of the slide deck, please just email me and I'll get that off to you. And let's see. Okay. And yep, there it is. Yeah, so it's still up there. I've left it up there so that you can get it off there. Also, if you want to sign up for any other classes we've got, I know I send this out and the link does show up, I think, on the main extension calendar and some other stuff. So you can use the QR codes there. Let's see, 2 hammerhead worms in the garden, spread some cypress shavings around. What do you recommend? So the hammerhead worms have been here for a while. I know every so often you might see things saying, please let extension know if you see a hammerhead worm. They've been here for a long time. They do prey on the earthworms, but their numbers, their populations are not as huge as the media would make it seem. You don't need to let us know if you have them. And generally speaking, if you see them, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a problem. So if you don't like them, you can always use salt. Same thing with slugs. And that will quickly end their lives because that will dehydrate them. But usually I tell people not to worry too much if you see them. If they're not going to eat your worm population away. You may have some that are under predation or predated upon, but not the entire population. They're just part of nature. Do we have a hydroponics class? No, not at the moment. That is something that I can look into. We do get side trainings within, and I can look into seeing about getting one of the specialists to do a training on that. We do some things like that. Let's see. I do have companion planting. That one's already up on the YouTube channel. No worries. And the New World screw worm. So we do try to do up and coming topics periodically. I did just do an invasives 2025 one. We didn't include the screw worm because that's not in Georgia yet. It is coming up in through Texas along the Mexican border, and the Department of Agriculture is hitting that hard. It has been here before, and they were successful in eradicating it. So they are trying to do that again. So if that gets up on our radar a little bit more, that is something that we might do some type of a presentation about. But right now, it is not something that needs to be really discussed much. That plus the Asian giant hornet and some of the others, those are out on the West Coast up in Vancouver. And we're not really concerned about that here. Now, we do have the yellow-legged hornet. That one is still down in Savannah. They've found some nests in South Carolina. So, but not up here. Avian influenza, yeah. So that is a problem. Again, we've had a few cases here. It tends to be an issue mostly in the spring and in the fall when you have migratory waterfowl that move through an area. Usually it's going to be along a flyway. It's a big problem up in the Northeast and up in the Midwest, northern Midwest, and that's going to be an issue that is probably going to be a problem for the next, I would say, 2 to 5 years. They are working on a vaccine. We don't know yet the efficacy of it and whether it will basically make it go away so we don't have to worry about it. But yes, they are working on that. This fall, I should say, hasn't been as bad with avian influenza here in Georgia. Egg prices have stayed fairly stable. We haven't heard a lot out of New York. We haven't heard a lot out of the upper Midwest. There have been some large flocks that have had to be euthanized, but generally speaking, it's not been as bad as in past years. Um, so I do occasionally do a backyard flock presentations, and we do talk about biosecurity in those. So if there's anybody has questions about that, I'm a chicken owner. I'm happy to share some of that, and you can also find that on the YouTube. All right. So no, the research has not been halted for avian influenza. So if you have any other questions, welcome to, we're about 6 minutes past. So I'm going to go ahead and end this. And if you have any questions, you are welcome to email me. If you want that slide deck, go ahead and email me. And that is about it. So thank you all for attending. I appreciate that. And if you haven't had lunch, go get it now. Thank you.